Happy Monday and welcome back to the Lorden Arts channel. I'm John Lorden. Thank you so much for spending some time with me here today. Case Cracked is the show where we look into a mystery and what are the critical pieces that help solve that mystery. Today's case was suggested by brain scratcher Tracy Ruddle and is one that's got me scratching my brain still, even though I know the answer. It's one that we like to call Christine Jessop's Recorder. It's October 3rd, 1984, in Queensville, Ontario, Canada, and 9-year-old Christine Marion Jessop was very angry. Recently, her father, Robert, had been jailed for misappropriation of funds at his place of employment, Eastern Independent Telecom. He was serving a 3-week sentence. Her mother, Janet, and her older adopted brother, Kenny, had plans to visit him that day, as well as take Kenny to the dentist. Janet felt that Christine was too young and didn't need to go to the detention center with them. As her mother spoke on the phone to one of their neighbors, Heather Hoover, Christine pleaded to go, but her mother told her no again and sent Christine to school. Christine felt betrayed. Her brother was going to get to see their father and show him the medals he'd won the night before during his team's baseball tournament. She had a new recorder and had planned to play for her father to show him how much she had learned. Janet and Kenny's day went as planned. After the visit and the trip to the dentist, they traveled to Sears, where they purchased the boy a new watch. But when they came home, Christine was not there. Her red bicycle was thrown on the ground near the front door, and surprisingly, her coat was found on a hook that sat far too high for Christine to have hung it. Confused, her mother and brother searched, but they couldn't find her. Janet checked with her neighbors and called her daughter's friends, but none of them had seen her either. Panicked, she called police. A thorough search of the house proved fruitless, but investigators found out that at 4 p.m., Christine was seen buying bubble gum at a nearby convenience store. Investigators also discovered that she had plans to meet up with a friend at a local park later that night, but she never showed up. Over the next 4 days, hundreds of volunteers, with the assistance of police, dogs, and helicopters, looked for any trace of Christine. Halloween came with its trick-or-treaters, and then Thanksgiving. Christine's 10th birthday passed on November 29th. Her presents left unopened, as the Jessop family seemed stuck in time. They refused to celebrate the holidays without Christine and had left everything in her room just as she had left it. New Year's Eve would forever change their lives. While walking through his land with his children, a farmer 31 miles away in the Durham region found a partially decomposed body lying in a field. Dental records, clothes, and the presence of a recorder positively identified the body as that of Christine. An autopsy would show that she had been stabbed in the chest several times. The presence of semen found in her underpants suggested a sexual assault, but her body was so badly decomposed that the medical examiner was unable to determine if that was actually the case. It was concluded that she probably died the night she disappeared. Because her body had been found in the Durham region, their police service now took charge of the case from York Regional Police. Their investigation immediately centered on one of Jessop's neighbors, specifically a man named Guy Paul Morin, who locals referred to as a weird-type guy. 25-year-old Morin lived close to the Jessop's house with his parents and worked locally as a finishing sander with a furniture manufacturer. On April 22, 1985, after several interviews, Morin was arrested. Durham's investigation would show that hair and fiber samples tied him to the scene. The hair not only showed personal contact, but the fibers showed Christine had been in his car. The trial began on January 7, 1986. Morin claimed that Christine had actually never been in his car. He had no criminal record and limited contact with the Jessop family. Prosecutors would also claim that with all the hair and fiber evidence, along with Morin's schizophrenia, he had to be guilty, even though Morin claimed that the afternoon she disappeared, he was at work. The Crown didn't find sufficient evidence to find the man guilty, and he was acquitted. However, the Crown exercised its right to appeal the acquittal on the grounds that the trial judge made fundamental errors regarding the jury. In 1990, a new suspect was identified when it was found that Christine's older brother, Kenny, and two other boys had molested Christine before her murder. When his DNA and that of the two other boys was tested, they were found not to be a match to the crime scene. This set off years of hearings and retrials for Morin. His second trial, which began in 1991, would be the longest murder trial in Canadian history at that time. 9 months later, on July 30th, 1992, Morin was found guilty of first-degree murder and given a life sentence. His time in prison would not be pleasant. Child murderers are usually kept out of the general population in prisons, but in this case, not Morin. Finally, January of 1995 comes around and Morin is exonerated through advances in DNA technology. When the samples taken from Christine's underwear were tested, they were found to not actually match Morin. This case had now set a second precedent that would become Canada's most famous wrongful conviction. 6 months after his acquittal, an investigation uncovered evidence of police and prosecutor misconduct. It also found that the forensic evidence in the case had been misrepresented. In January of 1997, Morin would receive over $1 million in compensation from the Ontario government, along with a formal apology. Now they knew who hadn't committed the murder, but who did? More years would pass. The Jessop's marriage fell apart. Robert would go on to remarry, but Janet never would. Because the DNA sample had become degraded through the years, it would take the help of genetic genealogists in the United States to provide investigators with a list of potential suspects. Finally, in October of 2020, just days after the 36th anniversary of Christine's death, investigators announced they had a match and knew who her killer was, a man named Calvin Hoover. Calvin Hoover was 28 in 1984 and lived near the Jessops. His wife, Heather, was a friend of Janet's and worked with Robert. His family had visited and attended barbecues at their home where their children played together. He was also on a list of potential suspects, but was never really a strong consideration. Genetic genealogists narrowed down the family tree, and investigators found Hoover's DNA sample already in their system. Unfortunately, that sample came from an autopsy that was conducted on him in 2015 after he took his own life. With closure on this case comes many more unanswered questions. Did Hoover convince Christine to go with him that afternoon? Her family believes so. They, along with investigators, feel that Hoover probably learned that Christine would be home alone by listening to his wife on the telephone with Janet that morning. They believe he drove to her house once she was out of school and offered to take her to the jail to see her father. That's why she's found with her recorder. From there, questions about her last night became too gruesome for the family to bear. But it does bring up another big question. Are there other victims? They ask that if anyone has any information, no matter how insignificant it may seem, to please contact the Toronto Police. Robert Jessop now lives in Keswick and suffers from Alzheimer's disease. When he was contacted and told of the discovery, he said that the news sickened him. After the revelation that Kenny had molested Christine came out at trial, Robert disowned his son. Janet still stays in touch with their adopted son, but was puzzled when she was told who the murderer was. At first, she didn't even remember the man, but as memories started to come back, she remembered one very disturbing detail. The night that Christine disappeared, as the family sat in their home waiting to hear from police on their search, they could hear someone in the distance screaming, "Help, help, please God, help me." At trial, Morin was thought to be the person yelling. Now Janet knows it was Hoover. Hoover also attended searches, comforted the Jessop family, and even attended Christine's wake. When Guy Morin was told of the discovery, he said that he was relieved and hoped the news would give Christine's family some peace of mind. He said that he knew DNA would always be the key to finding the killer. Janet still misses her daughter and wishes she had a chance to live her life, and wonders what Christine's husband and children would have been like. Her advice to other families who might be going through a similar situation is just hang in and never give up hope. She says now at night, she no longer has to pray for answers, but can comfort herself by praying to her little pixie, Chrissy, that she is resting in peace. Case cracked. We would like to thank the Toronto Sun, Global News Canada, The Star, CP24.com, Toronto.com, attorneygeneral.just.gov.on.ca, the Canadian Encyclopedia, and newspapers.com for their original coverage of this case. And of course, we've got to give a very big thank you to Christy Arnhart for researching and writing up today's story. Let's bring her on right now to discuss it with us. And here she is, Christy Arnhart. Hey, Christy.
Hey.
Well, you don't shy away from the tough ones, man.
Yeah, this one was a heavy one.
It is. It is. And it always makes me want to bring up this conversation, being a kid that was raised in the 80s. And, we started getting like stranger danger and like these school programs that were trying to make us aware of safety and things like that. But we're talking about a 9-year-old that, you sent off to school, and then it was up to her to come home alone in the 1980s. What do you remember about the 1980s and home safety and personal safety and things like that?
Well, I know I was a kid back then, and I have learned a lot since then, but you didn't have the sense of danger that you do now. I didn't worry so much about people breaking in. I was left in charge of my younger sister while my parents would go grocery shopping. And it was just simple, don't answer the door. Don't tell anybody on the phone you're here alone.
Yeah. 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 I was kind of in the same situation. I was the oldest. So I was, responsible for my younger brother and sister very frequently. And even when it came to don't answer the door, there wasn't even a strong, like, hey, make sure the door is locked. Like there'd be many times where you'd leave the door unlocked. Like you didn't even think about it,
That's something we had to watch. Where I lived, we lived on the highway, and people would come up day and night having car trouble. So we did learn to keep the door locked and not answer it. But even then, we talked to them through the window if they needed water for their car or whatever the deal was. So
yeah. That was, and at my house in particular, for a period of time, I had an aunt and uncle that lived right across the street, and it'd be very frequent. I'd be home alone with my brother and sister. My mom and dad would be across the street with my aunt and uncle. And there was just this thing where you would just leave the doors open and you would float back and forth between the two houses. Very, just a different time and a different mentality around all this. And yeah, there's newspapers and there's television, much fewer channels, and finding content about things that, like occurrences like this was just a different thing. You would hear about these types of stories if it happened in your particular neighborhood. You wouldn't necessarily hear about a story like this if it was, there's some that hit national coverage, but it wasn't like it is now, where there's just a regular channel for getting this type of information and understanding risks like this. So
there were more urban legends back then too.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Which I don't know if actually is helpful or not, because I know even back at that time you were like, well, that can't be true.
I know. You're like, no, that couldn't happen.
Right. So first of all, let's just say if you are a person that has information on this case, you can call 416-808-7491, or you can email Jessop Tip. That's JESSOP TIP at torontopolice.on.ca. Of course, I've got that information in the description box down below as well. So, Christy, what happened with this conviction with Morin? And we're talking hair and fiber analysis. What's going on with this?
Unfortunately, they targeted Morin pretty much right out of the gate. He wasn't popular in town. He was known to have a mental illness. He kept to himself. And when it comes to the evidence, they really had no evidence. They used junk science to push this through the courts and try and get a conviction. I know they said they used hair and fiber samples from Christine in this case, but it was one hair on her neckline that they found. The hair was microscopically similar.
Wow.
To Morin's hair. They had no DNA tag, which they couldn't have tested back then anyway.
Right.
But microscopically similar.
Yeah.
Now, the fibers that they found, They couldn't even say that it specifically came from this type of vehicle, this color, this model, nothing like that. It was within a pool of vehicles, but the way they presented it to the court made it sound much more definite.
Yeah, and once again, we're talking about a very big time difference and very big technology differences. And fiber analysis like that, very, very shaky. Because to your point, it's always, yes, it drills things in a little bit, and maybe you could even get to a specific model, like if there was a particular color that was only offered with a certain model of car. But even in that case, you're still talking about thousands of instances. Nothing like DNA where you've got a one-to-one match that's essentially going on with a DNA match. So you almost have to think of it like a funnel, and fiber analysis very much closer to the top of the funnel. Sure, it'll weed out some potential things, but in terms of pinpointing and saying like, that's like a fingerprint or like a DNA match, it's not. Yeah, that's really terrible that he had to go through that. But of course, he did get his official over $1 million, and we're sorry from the government.
I can't imagine that sorry meant much, but at least
No.
they said it.
Yeah, but especially after, keeping him in general population through that too. It's just, it was terrible. That was terrible.
Yeah,
It's almost like they didn't want him to survive so that he couldn't
that
come
was the
out.
way I felt about it. I mean, they
Yeah.
were in so much trouble over the investigation anyway. They didn't have the actual murderer, and that was coming out. So yeah, it would have solved a lot of problems.
Yeah. So we mentioned Brain Scratcher Tracy Ruddle contacted us about this case. She also brought up some other points about DNA. Just wanted to touch on real quick. She's kind of asking, when should familial DNA be used, and then versus direct testing? They are, as far as I know, always used in conjunction. So familial will basically get them the target. It'll point them in the direction of, it looks like it's this particular person, or sometimes it'll get down to like brothers. It'll look like it's these two particular people. But then they always follow it up with direct testing. And of course, there's several different mechanisms they use for direct testing. Sometimes they have to, because if they ask the person, they usually don't want to give up their DNA, especially if they know that they're, the person that they're looking for. So some of the stories we've heard are they will follow them around. They'll watch for them to discard a bottle that they're drinking out of and then get a DNA lift off of that, or chewing gum. Sometimes they'll find them throwing away chewing gum. And in one case we talked about recently, they couldn't get a direct sample from the person, so they got one from a family member, and that kind of cinched the, okay, now we know it's for sure this person. So
Absolutely.
yeah. And there are issues in terms of getting to use the databases. GEDmatch went through a change in ownership. They had changed their policy even right before that change in ownership. We've got the companies that are essentially doing this as a service, 23andMe and stuff like that. But we have one investigator in particular. We actually just talked about it on the Seriously Mysterious podcast last week, where he wrote a 50-page search warrant, essentially, got the judge to agree to that, and that opened up his access to GEDmatch. And because he figured out how to write that up, now that's a template that other investigators can use for their cases as well.
Thank goodness.
Yeah. And that's not just for GEDmatch. I know the public companies really try to downplay, and they do not publicize that they cooperate in investigations like that. But if they're presented with a warrant, they do. So that's kind of what happens with all that. So another twist in all this, Innocence Canada, which is a nonprofit organization, a lot like our own Innocence Project is here, they announced that the Durham Regional Police and the Toronto Police Service, which was the third agency that was brought into the case, needed to be held accountable now that Calvin has been named the killer. They believe that both departments grossly mishandled the whole investigation process, especially when it came to light that Hoover was a person of interest that was never really investigated. The group said it hoped, quote, a thorough review would guide future police probes and underline the importance of rigorously sticking to methodical investigative steps. And that's something that for this case certainly feels like it was missed. There's another near miss that kind of happens in this in the 90s when Kenny kind of comes into the view. And then they use the DNA at that point to rule him out. So at that point, we know that they're at least at the point of being able to understand one-to-one testing and doing that, but they don't test Morin. They just don't test him.
They constantly fumbled on this one, constantly.
Well, that's not even a fumble. That's like, okay, we can't risk this happening, so we're just gonna not talk about that and kind of move it off to the side. And oh yeah, we've got this great fiber evidence, and we have a microscopically similar hair on her.
One hair.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. So I hope that they do get some type of review there and it can help with those processes. And a case like this is actually kind of a perfect learning experience for that, because you've got a little bit of an excuse in terms of you're looking at something that's historical at this point. This investigation originally launched in 1984. There's been all kinds of technology and advances that have happened since. It might be a little painful because you're effectively saying, hey, this is our biggest screw up possibly in the history of this country. But if you're not going to learn from those things, what are you going to learn from? So yeah, I'm very hopeful that they can really ratchet down some of their processes and make sure that we don't have something like this happen in the future. Who knows? 20 years from now, maybe we're going to be talking about the big goof in genetic genealogy that none of us knew about.
And see, I'm following a couple of different cases right now where they're claiming that, no, that's not my DNA. And I'm really interested to see how they turn out.
Yeah. And we've kind of hit that. We talked about a story before where they almost thought that there was like a serial killer that was jumping from country to country to country, and they figured out it was someone that worked at the swab manufacturing plant that was contaminating the swabs. So there have been kind of mistakes when it comes to even DNA analysis and how that's being used. I know in some cases, sometimes you'll get a DNA match, like in the case that we covered in the first season of 3 Men and a Mystery, and they've got a guy in jail, and while they've matched his DNA to one of the bodies, essentially, that doesn't necessarily say that he pulled a trigger. Like there's still challenges sometimes with, maybe you found the right person and you can prove that they interacted with the victim, but can you still prove that they're the person that actually, committed a murder here? And it's still early. We really haven't seen one of these cases get all the way through the court system yet. We've got people, of course, with the Golden State Killer, he admitted to what he had done. So that case kind of got closed without DNA really, without the genealogy aspect of DNA really being run through a vigorous argument. So yeah, we'll keep our eyes out for that. It's coming. There's definitely going to be a case where that happens.
There will be, and it will be something crazy. It will be a twist nobody will see coming. So yeah, I'm watching for it.
Yeah. Well, we are thankful to have you always watching out for these stories. Thank you so much, Christy. And we have some other people to thank right now. Thank you, PayPal supporters Angela Welch Sola, Sandy Reed, Melissa Heinbach, Amanda Beard, Think Mutiny Publishing, Paulette Leonard, and Sandra Pyatt. If you'd like to support the channel, please visit lordandarts.com. There, you can sign up for Patreon, sign up for PayPal, or buy merchandise. All of it keeps us here with limited commercials, so we really appreciate your support. Remember, you can get another Lord and Art story every single week on the Seriously Mysterious podcast. A new episode is coming tomorrow and every Tuesday after that. Visit www.seriouslymysterious.com and don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcatchers. Or I'll see you again on YouTube on Wednesday with a new episode of Searchlight right here on the Lord and Arts channel.